We've been jumping into this series called How to Talk About Elephants for a year and a half now, thinking about essentially how we talk to each other. There are many things in life that we want to talk about, particularly things that affect us as people of discipleship, of people who want to follow Jesus. The question of how we engage with particular aspects of our faith and how that works out in our society is really important to us. But with this series, what we've tried to talk about is just beneath the level of the things that we want to talk about. We want to think about how we talk. And how we talk then affects how we see each other, how we transition some of the difficulties of being different from each other, and what it looks like as Christian community to have discussion, to have debate, to face challenges, many of which, let's be honest, are not challenges that we find answers in the Bible to, but are more, what does it look like as a follower of Jesus living in the contemporary world? What we also analyze without a great deal of research, you simply flick on a TV or earwig in a conversation, and you find that we're not good at talking to each other well. Our suspicion is that it comes from roots of perhaps our perspective on ourselves and our perspective on the other. When we talk about someone else, someone that's different from us, someone that has differences perhaps in view or background or whatever it is from us, we have a tendency to draw distance. And unfortunately, it often seems like we're stepping back to draw distance just to give us enough range to throw our stones properly. The early Christians, what they would do in their communities when they gathered together regularly to break bread together, to sing about the incredible stuff that God was doing in the world and also in them, they had this tradition of how they sorted out difficulties. They would tell stories about Jesus. They would gather round and they would remember things that they had heard. Some of the early Christians were eyewitnesses to these stories. Some people were maybe second generation Christians, and they heard these stories told. Eventually, these stories were compiled together into what we now call the Gospels. But the root of these Gospels was the stories of Jesus being told in Christian community, but being told with a purpose. It wasn't story time because we've got 5 minutes before bedtime. It was in the problems that we face, in the challenges that we navigate as followers of Jesus in the world. Does the telling of the stories of Jesus help us make sense of what we should do? So without a great deal of surprise then, I want to tell you a story of Jesus this morning. If you have a Bible with you on your phone or in a paper version, turn to Mark chapter 5. In Mark chapter 5, we find this encounter with Jesus, which you may be familiar with. It may be an old story for you. It may be a new story for you. But I want to tell this story. I want to do what I call a slow read. In my own devotional life, I do this sometimes. Perhaps you've noticed you start a plan. You say, let's read the Bible through in a year. And you turn, one day and it says, read Numbers chapter 1 to 4. You laugh because you've done that. And it's 4 chapters of just names. And you're like, this is a tough day. And you read as quick as you can to get through it. And that starts to develop a habit that the aim becomes, let's read through as much Bible as we can in a particular time. This is not a bad idea, but it's not all that there is to reading the Bible. Sometimes you read a story slowly. Sometimes you immerse yourself in the story and say, what if I was there? How would I be? And how would this story sound today? And that's how I want us to do things this morning. In verse 21 of Mark chapter 5, I'm not going to put it on the screens. You can look at it on your phone or on your Bible if you have one with you, or you can just choose to listen. That's okay too. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. This is a weird scene. This is probably not a big town. Even the big towns in those days weren't big towns by our standards. A few hundred people perhaps at most make up this community that Jesus is in. And in a small community like that in ancient Israel, one person would have prominence above all other people in that particular community. You might guess who that person would be, given that I'm telling you that just now. It would be the synagogue leader. The synagogue leader was the center of the faith of that particular community. He represented the understanding of how we follow Judaism. If you had a question about whether this was the right way to follow the law or that was the right way to follow the law, the synagogue leader was a great person to go and talk to because they understood and knew the law intimately. They would settle the debates. Probably the closest parallel for a synagogue leader to us today would be someone like a mayor in a small town. Because in those days, in ancient Israel, religion and politics and society life and community organization all happened around this notion of the synagogue, this gathering place where the Jewish people would come together. You may also have noticed, if you've read the Gospels before, that the religious establishment weren't always the biggest fans of Jesus, to put the point mildly. Jesus just wasn't good at being religious. And that always irritates religious people. When they bump into people who aren't religious, that's really annoying. And invariably, the rules seem to be that if you are religious and you bump into people who are not doing religious properly, you should go to all of their parties and point this out to them. It's your duty. So the Pharisees and the synagogue leaders and the teachers of the law, they seem to, maybe they just liked a free party, They come in, steal a few cocktails, some of those kind of weird small foods that look like big food shrunk. They would eat a few of them, and then once they've had their fill, they would then go, this is way out of order, what's going on here. They always seem to be there, just busting in on what Jesus is trying to do. Jesus is not the favorite person of the synagogue leaders. And here we have this scene of a synagogue leader at the feet of Jesus. This is not a dignified scene. I don't know if you've ever noticed this before. If you want to really dignify yourself, groveling on the floor in front of a person is not how you do it, right? When was the last time you properly groveled? Probably some time, because you're a person with good dignity and you carry yourself with appropriateness in society. Somewhere after you learned you could buy candy yourself, you stopped groveling at feet. Right? You realize, I don't need to do this anymore. I have standards and I have honor and I'll carry myself well. So this key character in the community is on the floor at Jesus' feet. This is strange. Not only is it strange societally, but we also know that this character probably isn't Jesus' biggest fan. He pleaded earnestly with him, the text says. And now we find out why. My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed. The Greek word is healed or rescued or saved. So that she will be healed and live. It's amazing how your principles change when you're faced with a challenge. It's amazing how what you thought you would do and how you thought you would handle yourself and how you're supposed to behave and what society expects of you and your way of behaving and carrying yourself all starts to crumble down when something very close to home gets a little bit scary. So a man who perhaps even would think of himself not in harshest terms of an enemy of Jesus, but as somebody who felt that Jesus needed sorting out, as somebody who would keep their distance, as somebody who would hold a standard in their society and carry themselves with grace and dignity, is now eating dirt on the floor in front of Jesus because my daughter is dying. And in one of the most brilliant verses in Scripture that I know many of you scholars have reflected on deeply, so Jesus went with him. Isn't it neat how Jesus does that sort of thing? I wonder what Jesus was planning to do that day. Maybe he had a really rocking teaching lined up for the disciples. And they were going to sit by the lake, chew down some falafel, and just learn together. And now we're hiking through the dust to go and meet some daughter that's dying. A large crowd followed because they have nothing better to do apart from follow Jesus around on a regular basis, it seems, and pressed around him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. Mark is not a fan of doctors. Or bills, one of the two. A woman. She didn't even get a name. She never gets a name. By the end of this story, we still don't know what her name is. A woman, Jairus, the synagogue leader, key, upstanding member of society, can wander into a scene and command attention. He can wander into the scene and ask for things and people listen. You go to Jairus with your theological questions and he tells you how to live. But a woman who is bleeding and has been bleeding for 12 years, count them, 12 years she's been bleeding for. Now, it's bad to be ill for 12 years. Some of you know that. Some of you have experienced that. Some of you have walked with someone who has been ill for 12 years. It's terrifying. It's horrible. You constantly ask questions like, will it ever get any better? But I promise you this, it's not as bad as this. Because this woman lives in ancient Israel. This woman lives in a Jewish society. And if you've been bleeding for 12 years, that also means you've been ritually impure for 12 years. That means you've never been able to practice your faith. That means you've never been able to go to the holy spaces and to all of the festivals and for any of the practices that go on. Because if you're ritually impure, everything you touch becomes ritually impure too. You hug your kids, they're now excluded from the community until they've gone through a process of cleansing. You touch someone, you literally touch a table and they touch it after you, they've now got problems because ritual impurity spreads. So this woman's an outcast. This woman's excluded. She lives outside of the community because she's not welcome in, because the impact of her being in is too great for everybody. The fascinating thing is, the figurehead of all of that religion is Jairus, the synagogue leader. Because he's the guy that keeps them on the straight and narrow. He's the guy that says to them, no, we've got to do what the law says. And the law says she needs to be outside of the community. So much is she outside of this community, we don't even know what her name is. A woman was there who had been bleeding for 12 years. 12 years of exclusion. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. Because she's thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be. The Greek word is healed, rescued, saved. She wants the same thing as Jairus wants for his daughter. Perhaps she's read the prophecies. Malachi said in chapter 4 and verse 2 that when the Messiah comes, he would carry healing in his wings. Perhaps she thought, if I could just get the edge of his cloak, if I can just catch just close to him, just have a minor piece of contact. This is a high-risk strategy, by the way, because remember, she's ritually impure. If she's ritually impure, if she touches Jesus, she brings him into her exclusion. Jesus now would need to step away from everybody else. Jesus now excludes himself from his religious practices for the rest of the week while he goes through the various purity processes. But Mark's story doesn't work like that. In chapter 5 and verse 29, it says, immediately her bleeding stopped. And she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. Fascinating thing about Jesus, he doesn't always work like you think he would. And where the process should work, that her impurity infects Jesus, what we actually see in this story is that Jesus' holiness infects her. And she finds herself healed. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone from him, and he turned around in the crowd full of all the Monty Python-ness that you can have and said, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples, realizing that this had become a scene in a future Monty Python film, said, "You see people crowding against you?" His disciples answered, "And yet you can ask, who touched me?" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet. Remember what Jairus did? She fell at his feet and, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. What's her perspective on Jesus here? What is she afraid of? Where do we get this idea that God is someone to be afraid of? Where do we get the idea that Jesus is someone we should be terrified of? Why is it that we tremble so often in the presence of our idea of God? Trembling with fear, she told him the whole truth, and he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has rescued or healed or saved you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." So this is a story about two daughters. Jairus, the high society man, and his daughter, and the unnamed woman who the Messiah calls daughter too. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead. This daughter may be healed, but your daughter is dead." Why bother the teacher anymore? Can you imagine this scene in modern-day Calgary? Can you imagine one of Calgary's top business leaders, one of the most influential people perhaps on the mayor's advisory team for business in the city, a huge donor to a local hospital? His daughter or son finds themselves at the point of death. They dial the ambulance on their phone. They punch in the numbers. The emergency services arrive. They load the child into the back of the ambulance while all the machines are attached and they start to beep less frequently than we want them to. They scream their way to the hospital. As they open the doors of the hospital van to start unloading this dying child, an immigrant family seeking asylum in Canada limp up to the doors of the hospital. The Emerge team are running out to take this stretcher from the back of the ambulance of this dying child, and they see the limping immigrant family, and they stop and say, "Let's just deal with this for a moment." How does the business leader respond? This is the kind of story that Fox News get really excited about. My goodness, this man paid taxes his whole life, is a huge donor, is the business leader of a society. This is the type of person that changes the world, and yet these people get the attention. "My daughter is dying," Jairus says. Sure, this lady's sick. I mean, she's not dying. The text doesn't tell us she's dying. She's just, she spent all her money trying to be healed, but she can wait. She can sort of find herself another time to come and see Jesus. She can come back later, perhaps. "My daughter is dying." How would that business leader feel to then hear the news? Having dealt with this apparently insignificant situation, your daughter is dead. Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him. And if you're the kind of person that underlines your Bible, here's 5 words you should underline. If you're the kind of person that writes Bible verses on your fridge, here's 5 words you should write on your fridge. Don't be afraid, just believe. Don't be afraid. There's a word, just believe. Some translations say only believe. Some translations that try and really dig deep into the grammar that Jesus uses here say something like, don't begin to fear, just keep believing. He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. Because in that culture, when someone dies, you have to bury them quickly. You don't want that sort of body in the house for too long. The problem is also, of course, that Jesus wouldn't want to be in the room with a dead body if he was a normal religious leader, because that creates more impurity. Jesus is kind of messing with this a little bit in this story as you see it. But when you have a dead person, who knows where the rest of the family are? It might take days to bring them in from farms and villages and towns in the surrounding area. So you would hire mourners. You would pay people to come and professionally mourn with you. This happens still in cultures of the world today. And so these people have gathered and they are wailing. And Jesus goes in and he said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they all laughed at him. It's amazing how quickly people laugh at Jesus. It's amazing how quickly Jesus seems so out of place with what's going on that our best response is to laugh. So he put them all out, teaching us a lesson to laugh at Jesus, perhaps. He put them all out. He took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her in Aramaic, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately, the girl stood up and began to walk around. And then Mark drops the bombshell par excellence on you. If you're reading the text, you've seen it already. And she was 12 years old. And they were completely astonished. This is a story of two daughters. One high society, one outcast. Both of them need rescued. Both of them need healed. But society treats them all differently. One man is used to being able to walk into a particular situation and demand attention, but he has to find himself at the foot of Jesus. Another has been excluded consistently and throughout her life, but she also finds herself at the foot of Jesus. But Mark wants you to see something. That these people look to us so different. They look like they're completely unlike each other. But this daughter has been ill for 12 years, and this daughter is 12 years old. To Jesus, they're pretty much the same. They are not different. They're not deserving of different treatment. They're not asked to wait in the wrong order. Jesus doesn't lean into society's norms and say, I'll help this and then I'll come back and get you later. But in the eyes of Jesus, as Billy Graham used to famously say, the ground is level at the foot of the cross. You can load up all of your reasons to be more deserving, or your reasons to be right when someone else is wrong, your reasons to be religiously appropriate when someone else is religiously inappropriate. But when it comes down to it, Jesus describes the cross really well in these 5 words to Jairus in the middle of the story. Don't be afraid, just believe. When we expect Jesus to load in reasons and explanations and understandings of how this all is going to work, when we perhaps want to load up our understandings of how we should go about behaving in these sort of situations, it's never as simple as how Jesus explains it. Because in Jesus' eyes, these two girls are the same. And Jairus is the same, and the crowd are the same, and I'm the same, and you're the same. And he says the same thing to all of us. Don't be afraid, just believe. And that's the gospel. And we make the gospel so much more complex than that sometimes. I wonder sometimes if Jesus says, don't be afraid, just believe. Over the centuries, we've changed into, be afraid, just behave. If you behave, you don't need to be afraid. If you don't behave, be very afraid. And God becomes this incredibly scary being that we know we're in trouble with all the time. And people constantly find themselves wrestling with this idea of this scary God. And we tremble in fear before him, not fear of reverence and awe, but fear of just panic and terror that what will this God do to us? Fascinating that Jesus never comes along and argues for God's existence. He seems to come along and say how you think about God is really faulty. Don't be afraid, just believe. There is a space for behaving as disciples. There is a space for allowing God's Spirit to guide and shape us into particular ways of being, but it's not the gospel. The gospel is about trusting in Jesus. The gospel is about just realizing that God has met us exactly where we are. Whether 12 years old or 12 years sick, whether high society or outcast society, the gospel meets us exactly where we are and simply asks us, can you trust Jesus? And we make it so much more complex than that. It seems to me that in our contemporary debate around life and all of its complexities, the simplicity of the message of Jesus that says we trust in Jesus and that's where we begin, that's where we have our conversations, that's where we start our discussions, gets moved to one side and other ideas come along. It fascinates me that for many of us, the discussion around our social and political debates and even religious debates focuses on this one particular word, inclusion. We We talk regularly about conclusion in contemporary life, not just in church, but in your workplaces, in your schools, in your universities. It's become the God of our new world that says as long as we're inclusive, everything else is okay. Political correctness leads us there. By the way, just so you know, we're the worst at being inclusive, especially inclusive people. Because we don't really mean inclusion. We mean selective inclusion. We mean we're welcoming to everybody that agrees to be welcoming like us. But there's all sorts of lists. All of us have a list. Even the most inclusive person has a list of people that are not on the list. Inclusive people invariably don't like non-inclusive people. And if you're not inclusive, you don't get to be in our group. There's some brilliant irony in there that seems to get missed on every news channel I ever watch. Let me tell you this about the church. We couldn't care less about being inclusive. What we're interested in is radical grace. Jesus isn't interested in the identity of this woman or the identity of that woman. He wants to do something way bigger than that. And why sometimes it feels like inclusion isn't at the front of the conversation within the church is because we're trying to do something bigger. We're trying to broadly open our doors and say everybody can follow Jesus, not just the politically correct, not just the people who fit into particular categories, whether liberal on this side or conservative on that side, and they have their little labels that they put on there. The gospel is not about selective inclusion. The gospel is about radical grace. 12 years old or 12 years sick, you can come to Jesus. You can find yourself in it. And you notice that Jesus makes nothing of any of the identities. I read the story today and described all of these people. Jesus never mentions any of it. You're a daughter, you're a daughter. And that's not their birth identity. That's the identity that Jesus speaks to them about. And we find ourselves so tangled up trying to be politically correct sometimes, trying to be inclusive, that we forget that God called us to be way more radical than that. If you want to have a laugh, just read Jesus' description of the disciples. He gathers a tax collector who is on the payroll of the Romans and a zealot who's part of a group that are trying to kill Romans. And he says, hey, you're going to join me with that guy. Like, that's way beyond inclusion. That's just suicide. But Jesus seems to realize that if he can bring them together, the gospel will do its best work. The church absolutely must be a welcoming place. The church must be the most welcoming place in the world. But I'm not going to borrow our idea of welcome from an idea of selective inclusion. I'm not going to borrow my idea of welcome based on what I see in the current newsreels and what I see currently in the newspapers or what the university are telling me the new policy is. I want to borrow my ideal of welcome from the radical grace of Jesus, who stops en route to save the politically influential person's daughter to deal with the outcast that needs him as much as anybody else's. The beautiful thing about the church doing well is you should be able to come to church and be treated exactly the same as everybody. Even the people that deep in your heart, you wonder if they should really be here. You might not speak it out, but you think, well, they really need to change a few things if they're going to sort themselves out. But this story is nothing about that. This story is about where people meet Jesus, where they bump into Jesus. Wherever that is, Jesus seems to think, I can journey with you. I can call you to come alongside with you. And more importantly, Jesus went with him. Jesus can come to us wherever we are. Westside's goal and challenge as we think about these things is to borrow our idea of welcome from Jesus. Daughter, your faith has rescued you. Little girl, get up. Society would deal with that story so completely differently than how Jesus does. And that's hard for us because it would be easier to be politically correct. It would be easier to know who it is that we shun for not being welcome enough and who it is that we welcome. But Jesus didn't call us to a simple path. Why it's hard to talk about elephants, why it's hard to talk about the controversies of our contemporary world is here's the baseline. No matter what the controversies of the contemporary world are, Jesus calls us to love all the people involved in it. And as Mother Teresa used to regularly say, Jesus sometimes comes to us in hideous disguises, in the really difficult people to love. And we all have people who are difficult to love. There's people that come up on your televisions that produce a response in you that you don't particularly like. They make you shout at your TV. We know that you do it. Some of the hackers have us on video doing it. There's people that irritate us. And yet somehow the gospel calls us. Sure, you can draw a political line and say that's abhorrent. The way that they talk is shocking. I don't like the things that they're particularly saying about X, Y, or Z. The gospel comes to us and said, but how do we reach them with the love of Jesus? How is the invitation extended to that person that says, you can't earn God's grace, you just need to trust in Jesus? Fascinating that Jesus treats them with equality. If you read this story just through the eyes of Jesus, you wouldn't even be aware that the people were different. And I find that quite remarkable. In Romans chapter 10, you may want to flip over to that in your text. You may want to just listen again. Paul says this in the midst of a very difficult argument for him about the inclusion issue, the first inclusion issue of the ancient church. How do Jews and Gentiles work together? And Paul says this, hopefully echoing what it is that we're saying this morning. There is no difference between Jew and Gentile. Notice for Paul, it's not now an issue of inclusion and identity. He actually says it just doesn't matter. There is no difference between Jew and Gentile because the same Lord is Lord of all and richly blesses all who call on him. It's almost as if Paul's been reading the story of Jesus in Mark chapter 5:4, and then he quotes it. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. But not all the Israelites accepted the good news, for Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our message? Consequently, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word about Christ. How do we talk about elephants? How do we talk about the difficult debates of our time? How do we talk about what it is that's going on in our world? We begin by talking about God, not about us. Notice, how does Paul deal with the biggest division of his world, of his society, Jew and Gentile? He doesn't talk about Jew or Gentile. He doesn't come up with a policy to describe how he's going to work about Jew and Gentile. He talks about Jesus. And he says, and Jesus is Lord of all of us. And that's the message of the gospel. That's the message of hope. So here's what I want you to think about for this week. Look at your conversations. Look at the things that you struggle with. Look at the places you feel excluded and the places where you perhaps exclude. And then reread this beautiful story of Jesus in Mark chapter 5. This beautiful story of a Jesus who steps above social norms, who moves way beyond the minimum politically correct standard and instead invites people to step in. And then let us ask this question. In every debate that we get involved in every complexity that we find ourselves arguing about, just pause for a moment before you get dragged in and ask, how do I first talk about Jesus in this? How do I first talk about the Jesus that turns to two daughters and says it's not about where you are in life, it's not about how different you are, it's just about trusting that he is the God who wants to reach out and rescue all of us.